Hi everyone, welcome back to Pacific Front Untold, and we're so excited that we have so many new members here to join us. I'm going to give a special shout outs to all of our new donors, for example, HY Yap, Jeffrey Kirkham, and William, who are recently joining our donating and joining us as a member of Pacific Front Untold. So if you haven't yet, please subscribe. It's free to do, or also join as a member, or better yet, go on our website and click on support us and support us in revealing archive and also supporting us in doing this type of work where we bring fresh new programming every Tuesday about Unit 731 from Sheldon Harris archive and many more archives. So yeah. Okay, so today we're going to talk about the Russian trial that America wanted to ignore about Unit 731. And let me put it onto the stage. Yeah, so and this is one of the
work that we've been doing. You can donate through the channel, and you can also head over to the Nova archive work. Oh my God.
Yes. Okay, great. So today we're going to look at one of the least remembered war crimes trial after World War II. And in December of 1949, 12 former members and commanders of the Japanese military were placed on trial in Khabarovsk, or in the Soviet Far East. They were accused of preparing biological warfare, experimenting on human beings, and using biological weapons in China. But the most important leader of the program, Ishishiro, was actually not in the courtroom. He was in Japan, where American investigators actually wanted his research. They were negotiating, as we were talking about, with the American investigators. And so this is not a story about the Soviet trial, but it's actually a story about how United States and Soviet Union actually competed in the knowledge produced by Unit 731. And yeah, so before we start, why don't we, discuss why so little people have actually heard about Khabarov's trial or this trial? Um, and I think that it's at the time there was so much like media hype about how this is a communist trial. The Cold War was happening. America was in a race with Soviet Union about the knowledge from Unit 731, and I think that's why there were so little. There were so little people who have heard about this trial. So let's go on and talk about this trial that opened on the Christmas Day of 1949. Um, if so, the trial opened on December 25th, 1949, and only lasted for 6 days. There were 12 defendants at the Soviet military tribunal. 12 were convicted, and their sentences range from 2 to 25 years in labor camps. One ultimately took his own life. And this was the only Allied trial devoted entirely to Japan's biological warfare program. And the Tokyo trial had already ended in 1948. And in the Tokyo trial, there was no one from Unit 731 that was like on the stand or like getting prosecuted at all. Um, and so this means that this is the first courtroom presentation of Unit 731's crimes from is from the Soviet Union and not from the United States. Yeah.
And I think, this already gives us a sense of why the trial matters. And the timing is also really interesting because, we're talking about December 1949, several years after the end of the war. So why did the Soviet Union wait until 1949 to hold this trial, Jenny?
Yeah, so I think Soviet officials were already interrogating Japanese prisoners since 1945, and they were also gathering scientific and military information from them. And by 1949, the Cold War was growing more hostile, if you think about it. And so then the trial kind of allowed Soviet Union to expose the Japanese war crimes while accusing United States of protecting principal perpetrators. And so then I think the timing is kind of legal and political as well, which is why at the time there were a lot of mainstream media talking about why this was a political show trial. And so I think the published record is more than a verdict. If you look at the document shown here in the English edition published in Moscow in 1950, it contains indictment, interrogation records, courtroom testimony, documentary evidence, expert findings, defense speeches, final pleas, and verdict. And some testimony is presented word for word. Other parts were shortened for publication, and so then this make the book really an important primary source and not just like a neutral one. Because it's like I said, it's word for word. There were testimonies, um and the ones that is actually made publicly available about this trial is selected, translated, and published by the Soviet government. So we should read it seriously but critically. And we need to compare its claims with Japanese documents, American intelligence reports, Chinese records, and later testimony.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, of course, when we look at, the trial and, just how it's set up, we also have to think about the record it left behind and how that record was produced. So can we trust the trial, the records that were published by the Stalin's Soviet Union?
Yeah, I don't think we should accept every claim automatically per se, but then the political motivation does not make the piece every piece of this evidence false. By central facts revealed at Khabarovsk's trial, and later confirmed by American records. And next week we're going to talk about the American records. And also these central facts are also revealed by Japanese participants later, and scholars and evidence from China. And so I think the responsible approach is corroboration and not automatic, like not an automatic acceptance or an automatic dismissal regarding this kind of uh, record and evidence. And so this courtroom held 12 men, but not the program's architect. These are people who were captured by the Soviet Union. For example, Ishishiro is missing, right? And the defendants included senior Kwantung Army leaders, medical officers, veterinary um, officers, um, like researchers, and lower ranking personnel. And General Yamato Otozoo had commanded the Kwantung Army at the end of the war. um Kachitsuka Ryoji, he had led its medical administration of the Kwantung Army. Kawashima Kiyoshi and Karasawa Tomio held important positions inside Unit 731. Like I said earlier, Ishishiro was missing, and Ishii had founded and directed the biological warfare network, and he returned to Japan before Soviet Union forces could capture him. And of course, we were talking about that earlier, that he actually faked his own death in Japan and had like a funeral. And American investigators then questioned him and the members of his network. And if you think about it, the Soviet Union prosecuted people that it possessed. And then the United States controlled like the access of many people that was the most responsible because Japan was occupied by America. So I think this is why it's like the courtroom only held 12 men, not the guys who were actually directly responsible. for the atrocities and war crimes held, I mean, done by Unit 731 and like its substations per se.
Mm. And I mean, would it be fair to even think that Ishii was ever, in danger of being prosecuted at the time?
I think that there was probably an early possibility that Soviet prosecutors could seek him as a war crime suspect. And American investigators also understood that human experimentation had occurred, and but U.S. officials increasingly treated Ishii as like an intelligence source, right? They kind of treated him as more like a consultant at one point. So then once this information was considered useful, I think prosecution was less likely. So I don't think Ishishiro was really ever in danger of being prosecuted because he's such a sneaky guy and he was so smart in the wrong way, in the way of like and like kind of manipulative of other people, like, and so I think that at the end of the day he wasn't really at risk of being prosecuted. And I think this the trial of the Soviet Union trial reached beyond Unit 731. The Khabarovsk trial was not limited to the Pingfong complex, but it also examined Unit 100, which con- um, conducted animal diseases, crop destruction, bacteriological sabotage, and attack on food systems. And then it also examined the Kwantung Army's command structure, which included the medical administration, um, and intelligence networks and whatnot. And so biological warfare is not simply just like a private project of a few rogue doctors. You can see that there was a whole system. It required prisoners, buildings, equipment, transportation, military orders, scientific personnel, and protection from senior commanders. Like, for example, Koizumi, who was the Ministry of Welfare department in Japan. And I think this trial's importance is that it presented this program as an institution rather than like a few rogue doctor running wild with their experimentation.
Hmm. And I mean that brings us to something important. When we talk about Unit 731, are we talking about just one man and one facility, or something much bigger? And does focusing too heavily on Ishii allow the larger military system to escape responsibility?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, we then, for example, even today on the Japanese government's website, you can see from their Ministry of Welfare and Public Health that there's still 1943 documents funded by them, who essentially funded Unit 731, about like the race theory, about like Yamato race and how Yamato race should be serving as a nucleus. And this is the same kind of people that funded Unit 731 and like its substations, like a whole institute of these theories that they wanted to prove. So I think that by focusing too heavily on Ishishiro does allow for this larger military system to escape responsibility. And of course, we know that during the Cold War, America really wanted Japan to be a part of its allies, for example, against China. And so then in that sense, it does allow the people who also planned the larger military system to also escape responsibility. And so yeah, so let's talk about this testimony by Kajitsuka Ryoji. And I think this is interesting because it testified that Japan's biological warfare preparation were aimed chiefly um, at Soviet Union, Mongolia, and China. But then he also said that didn't stop there, also against England and the United States of America. And we also know that for a fact that they planned a cherry blossom balloon attack on the United States close to the end of the war. There were also like proofs written by hidden histories by Jeff Kay about how they had a balloon attack in New Mexico. Um, and so, but I think we also need to be careful with this statement because it doesn't, it shows that the program had conceived this like strategic military capability, but not like, so then this really wasn't just a local research in Manchuria, in occupied Manchuria per se. And the Japanese military was really studying how biological weapons might be used against several possible enemies. I think that we need to do further research on like did they really attack England or not. That's something that's a lot of the items from World War II in Britain had just like recently been declassified, and we're actually looking into some of the items from like Hellship and yeah, England's participation in the Pacific War in like the 1940s.
Mhm. Okay, and if this was a much larger military system, what exactly was the system preparing for? And was Japan actually capable of launching a biological attack against the United States?
Yeah, I think Japan at this point explores several long range ideas, but the capability and planning, right, are not the same as operationally ready to use. They had a balloon system, which actually by 1954, we found in an army manual by the United States that America had adapted this kind of balloon system as well. And Unit 731 also demonstrated that regional biological warfare capability in China, as we've seen in the Ningbo attack that we've talked about, and also an attack on the continental United States. I- as we know, Pacific Ocean is so big that it would involve like different logistical issues, right? And I think that uh, the testimony really established intention and this interest and really establish what the goal of like Unit 731 really was. So let's talk about the inner prison that made human being part of the program. Um, so the inner prison was built to hold like 300 to 400 people at a time. And this is interesting because we don't really know how many victims exactly were in human experimentations. For example, if the prisoner survived a frostbite experimentation, like, and didn't die from it, then they're going to move that prisoner along to like testing biological weapons and at the ENTA station. So, and but now we can see from this trial that the indictment described it in a prison capable of holding hundreds of people, and and the prisoners were deliberately infected or exposed or used as experimental or like to experimental they were exposed to experimental weapons. And so researchers observed the progress of disease and examined the victims' organs, and those who entered the system were not expected to leave alive. And so the experiment served like two connected purposes. Researchers wanted to understand disease and they wanted to turn disease into a weapon, and the victims included Chinese people, Russians, and others held by Japanese authorities, the POW camp in Mukden, as we know, and that could have probably been used because they wanted to see how different race like would react to different um, diseases and bacteria as well. And we often know so little about individual identities because the system was designed to erase them, right? The prisoners were then called Maruta or log, so then they can erase the people's identity, and like they'll go from 0 to 1,000, just so then um, the scientists don't feel like they're humans and that they can just start from like 0 to 1,000 and then go on. as sample. So they kind of see these human people as examples. And here we can see that allegedly the prisoners were infected, observed, and killed, so researchers could measure the effects of disease and experimental weapons, like what we were just talking about.
Yeah. And I mean, this is just like such a dark part of the evidence. So, do historians know exactly how many people were killed, during the Unit 731 experiments?
I think they don't really know because post-war they burn and destroy so much evidence. But if you just look at like, but then it's like estimated thousands of people, and also if you look at the samples, right, of like some of the human experimentation, you know that like they go from like people were just then used as like a number, and then they go from like 0 to 1,000, like what I was talking about earlier. So there's not really a surviving list. Um, and also the records were destroyed by Japanese personnel, and all of the prisoners were killed in 1945. So I think historians mostly only know the estimates, but I don't think there should be like a final verified count, because as we know, by 1941 to 1945, there were also other substations of Unit 731. It was not just this one ping pong unit. And so I think that the destruction of evidence is a part of the reason why the number remains so uncertain still.
Mhm.
Yeah, and so let's go on to prisoners arriving as special consignments. The trial described this like bureaucratic process of like special consignment. I had no idea what it was, but basically, um, the Soviet Union, I mean, no, the Japanese units at the time arrested people and sent application for the transfer. And it's interesting because, I mean, just imagine what kind of people they were arresting, right? Because they were probably people that no one really cared for, because then like if for example if it's a guy who was like on the huge on the who's powerful, and then like his family member is missing, then people are going to look for them. So they mostly look for like people that could be delivered to Unit 731 without public trial, or like no one's going to make a fuss about it. One witness testified that more than 100 people were approved when he served at the headquarters of the Kwantung Army, and to transfer to Unit 731. And also, the phrase sounds administrative, but it doesn't, it conceals just like disappearance of like human beings. And I think this is important because it connects the lab to the military, police, and occupation system. And I think the Unit 731 needed a steady supply of prisoners, and other institutions provided them. For example, like the Kwantung Army would then supply people, right? Like the Kanpei Tai would then be like, okay, this is a suspect of like guerrilla fighters. So we can send them to Unit 731 without like without fuss, or like um without kind of hearing, or yeah.
Mhm. And I mean, there's obviously the difficulty in answering, what comes when it involves the people who were part of the program. Who were the people that were selected, for these special consignments?
Yeah, so I think it included people accused of resistance, espionage, or like communist activity, and then also like nationalism or just opposition to Japanese rule, because Japanese had ruled Manchukuo since September 18th, 1931, and there were people who were resistance to it, but then other people were probably homeless and then just labeled as a guerrilla fighter. Some were just probably ordinary civilians caught within occupation's policing system. And Japanese authorities call them criminals, but they really never receive any kind of independent trial. And I think the label gives military a way to treat the detained people as disposable. One of the Kwantung Army guys who wrote a book about their experience later said that if they really just captured three people on the street and then later just send them for a special consignment or special delivery, which turned out that they were just sent to Unit 731. And of course, he had no idea what happened to them after because no one ever survived Unit 731. And inside these documents of the trial, I think the victims then become like this human material. And I think trial records sometimes use the phrase human material. And this language is horrifying because it reduces a person to research supply. And it helped transform killing into an administrative and scientific process. Victims lose their names, families, histories, or legal identities at this time. And when we discuss Unit 731, we should really avoid using this kind of language, even though that it was like a neutral technical term at the time. And I think our responsibility is to expose the dehumanization while remembering that every victim was a person. As we can see from Kawashima, because they were working at Unit 7 for so long that I think they just kind of describe humans as like human material from amongst person of non-Japanese nationalities for bacteriological experiments. They have been so used to like this kind of process of dehumanization.
Yeah. And I think, you know, we also focus so much on the perpetrators and their signs as opposed to the victims. And I don't know how we can find a balance when it comes to discussing both and also representing the victims very well. How do you think we should go about, you know, handling both parties in this case?
Yeah, I think that there's like a danger in talking so much about perpetrators and then their science erasing the victims like memory, for example, or like the victims side of things. And I think the archive contains far more information about officers, researchers, and institution rather than like individual victims. We have examined, for example, like even their youth corp, how they remembered each other. And I
Yes.
think we need to explain the machinery of the crime without making the perpetrators like the only visible people in the story, for example, because they have erased so much of the victims, right? That we don't really know or who they were, even though that was probably thousands of people. There were probably more victims than perpetrators, for example. And I think the absence of victims' names should itself be treated as evidence of deliberate erasures. So yeah, here we're going to talk about how Unit 731 built biological weapons and at industrial scale. Um, from the trial, we learned that there were actually 4,500 incubators described for breeding fleas. The fleas were then spreading like the plague. And defendants discuss the ability to produce large quantities of plague bacteria. The inner prison was also used to describe in terms of capacity, and these figures really show how the persecutor, the pro, how the prosecution portrayed Unit 731 as an industrial military complex. And I think we should distinguish between production capacity and proven monthly output, because just because they're capable of doing it doesn't mean that they were actually churning that much out every month. And a larger point like remains really clear that this is not just a small laboratory conducting occasional experiments. This is like this was an institution, and they were actually capable of like capturing hundreds of people or like producing like thousands of plague bacteria capacity.
Mhm. And also I think another question that one would ask themselves is, why would Unit 731 need to produce such enormous quantities of bacteria and fleas? Important.
Yeah, I think laboratory research alone does not really require this production on this scale. I think it's they were preparing for field use. For example, we're talking about like Nomonhan and also Ningbo before, and also infected fleas could reproduce and spread the plague after being released, right? And so then makes it useful as a weapon designed to create epidemic rather than just one single explosion. And it's kind of scary to think about that this kind of biological warfare because it can very much be similar to like a natural outbreak. And I think the plague fleas were designed to survive delivery. Here from this testimony from the trial, the testimony described a ceramic biological bomb, and the bomb contained infected fleas rather than relying on liquid bacteria. And so then a small explosion charge broke the ceramic body open above the ground, and then the design attempted to keep the fleas alive during the explosion. And then once released, the fleas could then find rodents or human hosts and spread the plague. And then I think this shows the calculated nature of this research, and the weapons designed around the bacteria, the biology of like disease carrier, for example, like the fleas. And at the time as well, they were also encouraging, like, I think we've talked about this in our last, one of our last slides about and how in Southeast Asia they were incentivizing people to breed fleas by breeding mice, and it was also the same as like Occupy Manchuria as well.
Mm-hmm. But also, why use fleas instead of simply releasing the plague, bacteria into the world?
Yeah, I think plague bacteria are fragile when exposed to the heat, sunlight, or other environmental conditions. And fleas can protect and carry the bacteria. And also, fleas can also then infect rodents, using it as like a point to then infect other people and then allow the disease to continue spreading even after the original attack. I think that makes the resulting epidemic harder to identify and control in nature. And also, as we were talking about in Lingual, by Archie Crouch testimony connecting the research to attack in China. And this trial also talked about it, even though that um, it was in 1942. I mean, in 1940. The trial actually described each biological warfare operation in Ningbo in 1940, Chengde in 1941, and other parts of China in 1942. There were witnesses discussing like aircraft releasing the plague infected fleas. They also described like preparing for cholera, typhoid, and anthrax. And these accounts connect the laboratory research at Pingfong to actual military operation. But I think the exact consequences of each attack like require separate investigation, which is why we talked about Ningbo before, but we'll cover Chenda in another episode. And I think epidemic records, Chinese medical reports, local testimony, and Japanese military evidence must be compared. And we should also especially be careful with like the casualty numbers because later disease outbreaks could have like several causes, right? It could be a natural outbreak and whatnot. But we can for sure know that Unit 731, its unit was spreading diseases and having and conducting biological warfare.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and then the evidence we're looking at also shows that biological warfare wasn't attacking people directly. So would attacks on livestock and crops be considered war crimes, even if they did not immediately kill people?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think like when we're going to get to that with the next slide, of like attacking animals, crops, and water. I think deliberately attacking civilian food and water system could cause like a widespread of suffering and death. But the legal analysis depends on the target purpose, circumstances, and applicable law. And also morally and historically, these plans demonstrate that civilian survival systems were actually being considered as weapon targets, right? And for example, Unit 100 targeting animals, crops, and water. It focused partly on like animal and agricultural warfare. And I think that its researchers studied diseases like landers and anthrax, and were also investigating on ways to damage crops and contaminate water. I was reading the Shenyang trial, and one of the people doing like renovation of Unit 731 actually witnessed Ishishiro having like a copy of crop report on his desk. So we can know that for sure that that was also on his mind. This also expand our understanding of biological weapons, right? Like it's not just to kill the enemy soldiers, it can also destroy livestock, crops, and water to create hunger, displacement, and economic collapse. And I think biological attack could therefore like threaten an entire civilian society, as what we have seen with Cuba as well. The Cuba stock were attacked by the United States in the 1970s. um, and I want to talk about how August 1945 became like an operation of concealment. And next week we're going to talk about how US already knew about this before like the surrender of Japan. But in August of 1945, when the Soviet forces entered Manchuria, Unit 731 had already begun destroying evidence. There were pathogen cultures and experimental materials being destroyed. Buildings were demolished. Personnel were ordered to evacuate, and surviving prisoners were killed so that they could not testify. I think this destruction explained many later gaps of the historical record. What we found now, like, or like what we have been finding in the archives, are just items that were like luckily um that have luckily survived all this effort on destroying evidence. And it also demonstrate this consciousness of guilt, right? I mean, if you didn't do anything wrong, then why the hell would you to start destroying evidence as soon as your enemies or the allied forces were coming to like expose you or whatnot, as soon as you surrender? And I think the leaders of the program understood that the program could not be allowed to fall intact into ally hands, because they don't want their enemies to have this kind of uh information. So then what happened was that they then just destroy cultures, kill prisoners, blow up facilities, and evacuate personnel, um like what Kawashima was saying.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, if so much evidence was destroyed, how were the Soviets able to build a case?
th- First they captured members of Kwantung Army and associated units, because Soviet Union actually destroyed the Kwantung Army once and for all. And also they recovered documents from Japanese military archives. And then they questioned people who had worked inside the program and compare testimony across defendants and witnesses. But then the destruction meant that important records, victim identities, and physical evidence were then just permanently lost. And then the Allied paths divided, right? Because then Soviet Union and United States were no longer kind of in the same path of going to the future. Um, After Japan's surrender, both Soviet Union and United States wanted information about biological warfare, and the Soviets actually obtained prisoners when they captured Manchuria. And the Americans obtained Ishii and many senior researchers in Japan. So the Soviet Union eventually placed 12 people on public trial. American investigators produced secret reports and protected their sources. Neither government approached the evidence without strategic interest, and both view Unit 731's knowledge as military assets.
Okay. And I mean, this is
Yeah.
where, the story takes another turn, because after the war, the Soviet and the American approaches to the evidence began to diverge. So were the Soviets genuinely seeking justice, or did they also want the research?
Of course, they want the research, right? They have we have known that they've been doing bacteriological warfare like research as well. In fact, there was a anthrax leak in the 1980s, and they were probably interested in both like prosecution and intelligence. And Soviet interrogation begins years after the before the public trial, just to gather intelligence. And the like relatively limited sentences, and like later they just let them go, really raise this kind of legitimate questions. But we should distinguish like stronger suspicion from proof of a former a formal Soviet immunity bargain identical to like the American arrangement. Like America didn't put them at a public facing trial as at all. And yeah, so um Washington called it propaganda while hiding its own bargain. I think that Western officials and commentators dismissed the trial as communist propaganda, right? And so then that's why so little people know about this. And the Soviet presentation was certainly political, but I think America also had a serious conflict of interest. American authorities had already decided that Ishii's research or Unit 731's research could have military value. So then exposing the evidence might have raised this question of like why Ishii was not even being prosecuted. Or so, but then calling the entire trial propaganda, like by calling the entire trial propaganda, actually helped American arrangement outside of the public discussion. And I think the label became a convenient reason not to investigate any further.
Okay. So if both sides had political, strategic interests, how do we actually determine, what is this, if this record can be trusted? What part of, the Khabarovsky evidence has been mostly strong, confirmed since 1949?
Yeah, I think that it's for sure American investigators also received information indicating that experiments have been conducted on human beings, and later reports discuss the scientific value of data that could not be obtained through ethical experimentation. And so the decision was not based on complete ignorance of the crime. I think the intelligence value was like placed way before the prosecution, and that since 1949, like what part of the evidence has been like most strongly confirmed is that the existence of and military purpose of this entire biological warfare program by Japan, and their human experimentation on prisoners, mass production of pathogen and disease carriers, and also biological warfare operations in China, and also the destruction of evidence in August 1945, as well as the American protection of important members of Ishii's network. And I want to say that this political trial can still hold like historical evidence, even though that is deemed political. it was happening in 1949 instead of 1945 right away. But we should not ask like whether or not Soviet government was trustworthy. We should ask whether particular claims are supported by other evidence, and defendant testimony can be compared across witnesses. The Japanese military records can confirm unit structure and orders. And American reports later reveal what the U.S. investigators had learned, and Chinese sources help document the attacks and their efforts and their effects. And or even by Archie Crouch, an American missionary who then later testified about how he survived the biological weapon attack and its effects. And also later Japanese testimony helped test details from 1949 record. And I think good history or good historians should compare these sources and not just choose like one government story. Um, and so I think all 12 defendants were then, of course, convicted, and all of them were found guilty. And four received 25-year sentences, and others received shorter terms, with lowest sentence being 2 years. But they all like didn't receive a death sentence, and most surviving prisoners were returned to Japan by 1956. I think the sentences kind of appear kind of light when compared to like crimes described in the courtroom, right? Like they're breeding fleas and they're breeding like bacteriological warfare and producing like weapons. But and then also if you think about it, some defendants then later return to ordinary life. Um, I think the result is just punishment and not like accountability if you think about it. But then if you think about it, the 12 defendants, they were also not the architect, right? So should they be held accountable? That's kind of the question that we should be asking, I think.
Yeah, and I mean, there was, I guess, some level of punishment, but when we look at the broader picture, you ask yourself, was there really justice? So, what would have been meaningful justice? Having looked at what the war looked like and the after effects. Obviously, looking at civilians and the families impacted, have we come across any feedback or testimonies from them to just say this is not justice, or this is what justice would have looked like after the war?
Yeah, I think meaningful justice could have looked like prosecution of senior leaders, including Ishii, public disclosure of the evidence, identification, acknowledgement of victims, like maybe publish of like a log, a actual an actual like log of the logs, like who were actually the victims, and also investigation of the institutions that enabled the program, right? But instead, a lot of these people who participated in these institutions then worked at other institutions, as we've explored from like, which then led to like an outbreak of AIDS because then they were so used to not being like held accountable. And also preservations of records and testimony, as well as recognition, education, and appropriate redress for affected communities. But that never really came to be. Um, so the trial convicted 12 men, but I think the principal architects escaped prosecution and the victims remained mostly unnamed. And the United States concealed evidence to protect an intelligence arrangement, if you think about it. And the Soviet Union used proceeding to support its Cold War position. And Japan didn't even conduct like a large post-war reckoning with the medical and military institutions involved. Instead, it turned into something else. Um, and many former personnel later worked in medicine, university, government, and industry. And so I think this trial, like, for sure, created a record, but it didn't really create full justice. And so, yeah, I think the last thought is that I think this trial cannot be just reduced to one simple label it was political, but it also exposed like real crimes. And the Soviet Union revealed evidence while trying to use it for like its own purposes, right? And the United States dismissed the trial while concealing its own bargain. I think neither power placed the victims at the center, and their experiences became evidence to be collected, traded, hidden, or weaponized. I think our responsibility today is different. We preserve these records so that victims are not just reduced to intelligence data or forgotten names. I think that remembering is not to choose American version or the Soviet version of the story, but is about reconstructing the truth so that both government fail to tell completely.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
I've learned
All
quite a
right.
lot today. Now,
I'm going to read the comments from Doug.
yeah.
Congrats. I think he said congrats when we were talking about like our new members and our new donors. And some newspapers called the trial lack of prosecuting Ishishiro. I think that's what and Emperor Hirohito as war criminals, the dog that didn't bite. Yeah, I think so. Um, but Ishishiro was again he faked his own death in occupied Japan, and America was in charge of occupied Japan. So there was no way that he was going to be at Soviet Union at the trial facing justice, right? And it wasn't really facing justice to begin with. And Tom said, "Thank you. All right, thank you so much, everyone, for watching. And yeah, please join us next time."
Yes, thank you very much.